The day of the funeral dawned with a dry wind blowing golden leaves through the empty streets of Maple Creek. 79-year-old May Holloway stood in front of the chapel, clutching her grey coat in both hands. She had imagined this moment for nights on end, saying goodbye to George, her lifelong companion. What she never imagined was the silence. Not a single child, not a single call, not a single message. Only the sound of the old organ and the murmur of the minister who spoke of love and family to empty pews. May listened, but from a distance, as if she no longer belonged to that world of correct words and shameful absences. As the coffin was slowly lowered, May felt it wasn't just her husband she was bearing, but a whole history of unrequited devotion. The years of unrequited loans, of dinners where she served and the others barely looked. Each handful of earth that fell seemed to weigh on her chest, mingling with the bitter realization that love, without reciprocation, becomes a habit. She stayed until the end, while the gravedigger covered the last wooden corner. No one walked her to the car. No one offered her their arm. Only the echo of her own name in the icy wind and a thought that was beginning to sprout. Perhaps loneliness was more sincere than feigned company. When she got home, the hall clock read 3:30. May left her purse on the hall table and without taking off her coat went straight to the sofa. The silence was so thick she could hear the dripping faucet. In the kitchen. She had spent a lifetime sharing that roof with someone, and now all that remained was the smell of stale coffee and withered flowers from the wake. She stared at a framed photo, George holding the children in a lake, everyone laughing, years before distance became customary. May knew that day was no accident. The children hadn't forgotten the funeral, they just didn't care enough to show up. That certainty, though cruel, was the first step towards something she didn't yet fully understand, her liberation. Later, as the afternoon turned grey, she approached the window, cell phone in hand. She wasn't looking for anything, but her finger slid idly across the screen. There they were. Her daughter Celia smiling at an elegant brunch, drink in hand. Her son Peter, golf club raised, celebrating under a blue sky. The photos were dated at the same time as the funeral. May didn't cry. She just closed her eyes, took a deep breath and leaned her forehead against the cold glass. Outside, neighbor Lorraine left a hot soup at the door and left without ringing the bell. May turned on the dining room lamp and looked around the house as if seeing it for the first time. The walls still bore the marks of the paintings George had hung, the same ones Peter promised to restore someday. On the sideboard, a blue folder contained years of receipts, bills and letters, money sent to the children, trips paid for, loans with no return. May reviewed them calmly, without rancor, like someone looking at someone else's album. She understood that she had confused help with love, and that the habit of saving others had left her without the strength to save herself. Outside, Lorraine's soup was still steaming. Inside, for the first time in decades, a silence reigned that didn't weigh her down. It was newborn freedom. That night, May didn't sleep. She sat in her old sewing chair, where she used to mend Peter's uniforms and Celia's dresses, and began to write. It wasn't a letter, nor a complaint, but a list. Everything she had given, everything she would never give again. When she reached the end, she underlined 3 words. Never again like this. She promised herself not to punish anyone, but also not to give away her peace. As the sun filtered through the curtains, she decided that the funeral would not only be the closing of a shared life, but also the beginning of her own. In the morning, the smell of toast filled the kitchen. May made a cup of tea and sat at the table, watching the steam slowly rise. On the chair next to her, George's jacket still hung, as if he might return at any moment. The woman folded it carefully and put it in a box along with an antique watch, his wedding ring, and a black and white photo. It wasn't a dramatic goodbye, but rather a kind of internal ordering, a way to begin clearing the space that memories had occupied for too long. Her heart ached, yes, but she also felt a new, almost serene clarity, as if the absence of her children had cleared away the noise that had accompanied her for years. Mid-morning, the phone rang. It was the family lawyer, Mr. Cartwright, who offered to come by to review some outstanding will documents. May accepted without much thought. When she hung up, she looked at the calendar on the wall. The crossed-out days seemed like the marks of a journey that had just begun. She decided to dress calmly, comb her white hair, and put on the mother-of-pearl brooch George had given her for their 40th birthday. It wasn't vanity, it was self-respect. She wanted to arrive at that appointment with the same dignity with which she had endured her loneliness. The lawyer arrived punctually, carrying a leather briefcase and a look that mixed respect and caution. On the table, he spread out the documents George had signed years ago, back when they still believed everything would remain the same. May listened attentively, without interrupting. Each clause seemed an echo of her former faith in the family. Property divided between Peter and Celia, joint accounts, provisions full of goodwill. But that goodwill had been spent. With a firm voice, May asked what she should do to modify it. Cartwright, surprised by her decisive tone, explained the legal steps with precision. As she said goodbye, she didn't ask for time to think. She made an appointment at the bank for the next day. That afternoon, as she walked back from the lawyer's office, May stopped in front of a store window where her silhouette was reflected. For a second, she didn't recognize herself. The woman peering through the glass wasn't just a widow. She was someone who had survived her own oblivion. In her hands, she carried a folder of papers, and on her face, a calm expression bordering on defiance. The icy wind stirred her hair, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of the approaching winter. Perhaps because now she knew she could endure it without anyone else. When she got home, she found an envelope slipped under the door. It was from Celia. Inside was a brief note. "Mom, we're sorry we couldn't make it. It was all so sudden. I promise to stop by next week." Not another word. May folded it carefully without anger and left it on the sideboard. She had learned to read between the lines, and what that letter silently said was that she wouldn't be coming. She climbed the stairs slowly, pausing on each step as if she were also climbing inside. In the room, the air smelled of wood and lavender. She sat by the window and for the first time in days wept silently. Not for the loss, but for the years that had slipped away, trying to keep together those who never wanted to stay. The next day, Peter showed up unannounced with his wife Meredith in tow. They arrived with the tone of someone coming to help, although their gaze was more focused on the value of things than on the state of their hearts. They asked about the house, the insurance, the bank. May listened politely, served tea, and waited for the exact moment to say what she'd been keeping inside, that everything would change. She didn't raise her voice or tremble. She explained that she would review the will and that every future decision would be hers, without consultation or concessions. Peter smiled uncomfortably. Meredith, on the other hand, lowered her eyes. It was the first time May felt someone truly understood what she was saying. Peter and Meredith left before sunset, leaving behind a tense air and an even heavier silence. May closed the door slowly, breathing with a calmness she hadn't felt in years. She knew there would be more attempts, more excuses, more visits disguised as concern. But something inside her had changed. She no longer sought understanding, only respect. She walked over to George's desk, opened the top drawer, and took out a black-covered notebook. There she began jotting down names, dates, and amounts, not out of resentment, but from memory. Each number was proof of how much she had given without receiving back. And when she finished the list, she wrote at the bottom, "It's over." During the night, the rain pounded persistently against the windows. May, sitting in the rocking chair, listened to the sound of the water and felt that time was washing away more than just the dirt. The house, for the first time, seemed to belong to her completely. She made a cup of tea, lit a candle, and allowed herself to think about Ethan, her grandson, the only one who still called her without asking for anything in return. Maybe he didn't know about the funeral because no one had told him. That thought comforted her. Before going to sleep, she decided to write him a letter without reproaches, just to tell him that his grandfather had passed away peacefully and that she was fine, even if the truth was different. The next morning, May went down to the garden with a blanket over her shoulders. The sky was pale, and the first frosty leaves crunched under her steps. She stopped in front of the rose garden she had planted with George more than 30 years ago. Some branches were dry, others still struggling against the cold. She took the shears and began pruning, with slow, precise, almost ceremonial movements. As she cut away the dead branches, she thought about how life resembled that garden. You can't expect something to bloom if you don't dare to remove what no longer gives life. When she finished, she breathed in the icy air with a new serenity. She had begun pruning her story as well. Inside the house, she placed the letter to Ethan on the table and left it open, as if that would ease the weight of so many pent-up words. She didn't write about the absence of her children or the emptiness of the funeral. She spoke of summers, of rose gardens, of how George taught her how to repair old clocks. She told him that every person deserves to build something worth caring for. At the end, she signed it with a simple phrase, "I love you," unconditionally. Then she placed the letter in an envelope, ready to send it. As she sealed it, she realized that true love doesn't need witnesses, only consistency. 2 days later, Celia finally appeared. She arrived unannounced, wearing dark glasses and an expensive scarf that contrasted with the damp autumn air. She feigned concern, talked about work, about how difficult it had been to process everything, and between carefully measured sentences slipped in her true intention, to find out what would happen to the house. May listened without interrupting, with a calm expression that disarmed any rehearsed speech. When Celia finished, May simply said she had already made a decision and out of self-respect didn't intend to explain it. Her daughter laughed in disbelief, accusing her of ingratitude. But May didn't respond. She understood that arguing was a way to remain tied to what she had decided to let go of. That afternoon, after Celia slammed the door, May sat by the window. The sun was setting behind the hills, turning the sky orange and violet. On the table, the documents awaited her signature. She reviewed each page, each clause, with a care she'd never allowed herself before. George always took care of such things, but now she was the one putting the finishing touches on them. That administrative solitude, which would have once frightened her, felt like a declaration of independence. When she signed, she felt neither revenge nor relief, only silent justice. The kind of justice that needs no spectators. Ethan arrived on Sunday afternoon, just as the first drops of rain were beginning to hit the roof. She hadn't heard about the funeral. She'd found out from a message someone had forwarded late, and seeing him walk through the gate, May felt something inside her settle. The 23-year-old boy was wearing a soaked jacket, and his face was filled with guilt. She greeted him without reproach, just with a calm gaze and a hot cup of tea. They spent hours, talking about everything except the past. Ethan truly listened to her unhurriedly, without looking at his phone. And in that simple gesture, May recognized something she thought was extinct, a sincere presence. After he left, the house fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence. It didn't weigh heavily. It didn't hurt. May went up to the attic and took out a box containing the new will documents. She reviewed the names, the percentages, the conditions. That night she decided to change everything. Not out of resentment toward Peter or Celia, but out of gratitude for the one who still knew how to be there. In her mind, George's voice seemed to approve every decision. Sometimes love isn't measured in blood, but in the gestures that remain when everyone else has left. The next day, May walked to the bank downtown. The air was chilly and the ground covered with dry leaves, but her stride was steady. At the office, the manager greeted her with a friendly gesture and offered her a seat. She calmly explained what she wanted: to create an irrevocable trust in the name of her grandson, Ethan Holloway, with clear terms until he turned 30. No emotion changed her voice, though inside she felt this act was more symbolic than financial. It was her way of demonstrating what she truly valued: silent loyalty, presence, affection that isn't negotiable. On her way home, May stopped by the local bakery and bought 2 sweet rolls, the same ones George used to order on Saturdays. Sitting down in the kitchen, she broke one in half and placed it on an empty plate in front of her, as if sharing that moment with her memory. Outside it was beginning to snow, and the first white specks were settling on the windowsill. For the first time, winter didn't feel so long. There was peace in every gesture, even the simplest. The house, now free of outside demands or expectations, breathed with her. That night, May's sleep was light, almost transparent. She dreamed of George sitting on the garden bench, smiling without saying a word. When she woke up, dawn tinged the room with a cool blue hue. She got up slowly, made herself some coffee, and opened the living room curtains. The day was clear with a calm that invited her to breathe slowly. She turned on the radio, and between old songs heard the announcer's voice talk about the first snowfall of the year. She smiled. It was as if the world somehow confirmed that everything was starting over. Her house was in order. Her life was beginning to be too. Later, as she was packing the bank papers into a box, she heard a knock at the door. It was Lorraine, the neighbor, carrying a basket of freshly baked bread and a genuine smile. "I saw you through the window and thought you could use something warm," she said. May invited her in. And for a while they talked about simple things: the weather, the flowers in the garden, the prices at the market. There were no grand confessions, but something more valuable: genuine presence. As they said goodbye, Lorraine squeezed her hand and said, "I can tell you're breathing differently, May." She only responded with a slight nod, knowing it was true. When Lorraine left, May stared at the closed door for a while. She was surprised by the feeling of gratitude that surged through her chest, a simple, undramatic emotion. She thought about how little it truly takes to feel accompanied, someone to listen, someone to arrive without asking for anything. She walked through the house, observing every corner with a mixture of nostalgia and pride. She no longer saw ruins, but space to start over. She went up to the attic and took out the sewing machine she hadn't used in years. She wanted to sew new curtains, something that would represent her own rebirth without waiting for someone to do it for her. As she stitched, the afternoon slowly faded. The sound of the thread slithering reminded her that she still had control over something, even if the rest of life felt uncertain. During a break, she made tea and sat by the window to watch the snow cover the streets, leaving everything silent. She thought of Peter and Celia, wondering if they would ever understand the weight of her absence. She didn't hate them, but she didn't justify them either. She had learned that love without respect becomes an unpayable debt, and that debts sooner or later must be settled. That night, as the clock struck 10, May turned on a small lamp in the living room. The warm light fell over the new curtains she had sewn, giving the room a different, more personal feel. She took out a notebook and wrote a short list. Buy seeds, paint the porch, invite Lorraine over for lunch. Small goals, but meaningful. Each one represented a reclaiming of space, a decision, a life. She leaned back in the armchair and realized she no longer expected calls or apologies. Her peace depended on no one else, and that, she understood then, was the purest form of self-love. The next morning she went to the lawyer's office to sign the final trust papers. The process was quick and uncomplicated. May watched as the official seal fell on the document, marking the end of a milestone. The lawyer congratulated her with a smile, but she only responded with a slight nod. She didn't need approval, just the facts. As she stepped outside, the winter sun illuminated the wet sidewalk, and May breathed deeply, feeling the air no longer heavy. If this story touched you, support it with a like, and share it with someone who needs to set boundaries today. That helps it reach more people. That afternoon, Peter called again. His voice sounded more tense than before, as if he sensed something was already irreversible. He asked about the trust fund, insinuating that maybe Mom wasn't thinking clearly. May listened without interrupting, let him finish, and responded with a calmness that disarmed any attempt at manipulation. She told him she was more lucid than ever and that her decisions needed no justification. On the other end of the line, there was silence. Then a short sigh, and the call ended. May turned off the phone, placed it on the table, and smiled with a sweet weariness. It wasn't victory. It was closure. After dinner, she pulled a box from the closet and found an old vinyl record player. She put on one of George's favorite records, a soft 60s tune, and let the music fill the house. She moved the furniture a little to the sides, leaving space in the center, and began to move slowly, barely swaying. It was a small, almost imperceptible dance, but in that gesture there was immense freedom. Her body, tired but firm, remembered what it was like to feel alive. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world with a calm that seemed made just for her. When the song ended, May turned off the record player and sat for a moment in silence, her eyes closed. She remembered George's voice once telling her that true love wasn't a promise but constancy. She thought about how, even after his departure, he continued to be with her in the simple gestures, the hot tea, the manicured garden, the peace of a day without demands. She climbed the stairs slowly, pausing on each step to touch the newly repaired banister. The firm wood beneath her hand was a silent metaphor for everything she had rebuilt alone. For the first time in years, she felt like the home belonged to her completely. The next morning, the postman dropped a letter in the mailbox. It was from Ethan. He said he'd read hers 1,000 times, that he was sorry he hadn't been, and that he wanted to visit her this weekend. May read it slowly, with a smile that spread without permission. She made coffee, put fresh flowers in the vase, and wrote down on a piece of paper, "Make apple pie." It wasn't out of habit, but out of desire. As she looked out the window, she saw the sun slowly melting the snow. In that instant, she realized she wasn't waiting for anyone. She was simply ready to receive. Ethan arrived on Saturday wearing a grey scarf and carrying a box of cookies. Upon entering, he stared at the house, surprised by the changes, the new curtains, the smell of baking, the warmth of a place breathing renewal. May hugged him wordlessly, and he responded with an awkward but sincere gesture. They spent the afternoon talking about simple things: work, college, stories about her grandfather. Between laughter and comfortable silences, May felt like time no longer owed her anything. She looked at him and thought that, although ties of blood can fail, those of the heart are capable of remaking any history. As night fell, May walked him to the door. The snow was falling again, fine, like a dusting of light. Ethan promised to return soon, and she believed him. As the car pulled away down the empty street, May watched the red lights until they disappeared. She closed the door, leaned her back against the wood, and sighed, not with sadness, but with profound gratitude. She had found her peace in the simplest places: a tidy house, a present grandson, a life without excuses. And in that final silence, she knew that, after all, she too had learned to show up. That night, May sat at her desk and lit a candle. On the table were the signed papers, the trust envelope, and Ethan's letter, folded carefully. The sound in the house was different, almost breathing beside her. She took a blank sheet of paper and wrote one last note, addressed to no one. Showing up isn't being there, it's staying when it matters. She folded it and put it in the desk drawer where she'd previously kept receipts and bills. Now that space, like her life, was clean of debt. She poured herself a glass of wine, something she hadn't allowed herself in years, and silently toasted everything she'd finally let go of. The next morning, the first rays of sunlight illuminated the garden. The roses, despite the cold, were beginning to bloom again. May walked out onto the porch with a blanket around her shoulders and sat on the bench where she had so often shared silence with George. She smiled, took a deep breath, and let the fresh air fill her lungs. There was no sadness or regret, only the certainty of having lived with dignity until the end. Inside the house, the clock struck a new hour, but she no longer needed to keep track of time. Hers at last belonged to her.